Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Red Lines. Thousands of U.S. citizens took to the streets over the weekend to demonstrate their opposition to the Trump administration's push to war with Iran. The protests follow the U.S.'s assassination of top Iraqi and Iranian military leaders late last week. The Anti-War Answer Coalition organized demonstrations in close to 90 cities across the United States, from New York City to Atlanta to Boise, Idaho, Los Angeles, and beyond. The Grayzone's editor, Max Blumenthal, addressed a crowd gathered outside of the White House in Washington, D.C.
So it's up to us to be in front of their offices. It's up to us to be informing our fellow citizens about the lies we're being told. It's up to us to be in the face of a bought-out, sold-out corporate media. It's up to us to be the real resistance. The resistance hasn't been out here at all. They've been pushing for more war, not less. And we have to make one thing clear, that if war comes on Iran, it will be for the same reason that this government has been threatening war on Venezuela, on North Korea, on Syria, and why they've just done regime change in Bolivia, because these countries refuse to be absorbed into the empire. We need to stand in support of independent states and international law and support their right to be sovereign.
To discuss this weekend's events as well as how to revitalize the anti-war movement in the United States, I spoke earlier with Ben Becker, an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Ben Becker, thank you so much for making time to speak with me this afternoon. You and the Answer Coalition have been at the forefront of the anti-war movement for nearly 2 decades. Give us a breakdown of the demonstrations we saw across the United States this weekend.
Well, it was really an encouraging sign in terms of the resurgence of an anti-war movement in the United States. There were, by our estimates, around 90 cities that had some anti-war action on Saturday or Sunday this past weekend. This was within about 48 hours after the assassination of General Soleimani. We had put out a call to action when we first saw that Trump was going to deploy 750 new troops to Iraq after the airstrike that had killed 25 a few days earlier. And then there were a few dozen cities that were already going to participate in that. And then when the news of the assassination came, which was, I think, understood globally as an extreme provocation, extremely reckless, and could potentially bring the whole world to the brink of war, and a very destructive and disastrous war at that, I think a lot of people just sprang into action. And it wasn't just the big cities that you would sort of come to associate perhaps with anti-war action, the San Francisco and LA and New York and DC, but places like Boise, Idaho and Birmingham, Alabama had anti-war actions. So a truly national anti-war movement in both the quote red states and the blue states is coming into existence to meet this war danger.
It's very encouraging to see. And Answer has also led in terms of resisting the Trump administration's coup attempt in Venezuela, as well as its successful coup in Bolivia. What makes this kind of organizing possible?
Well, I think the first thing is having a clear political line, clear political orientation about what sort of system we're living in, and a global system of imperialism, and that the United States for the last 20 some years since the fall of the Soviet Union has been on a rampage to ensure that it remain the only polar, a unipolar world order be preserved, where they have a preponderance of military power, where they have a projection of military bases and military might all over the world. And any country, whether almost regardless of whether it's left-wing and socialist, even just a nationally independent country like Iran, is seen as a threat to that world order. And so we have an understanding that regardless of who's in power, in whether it be Democrat or Republican, the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex is really a permanent system addicted to war, and that it's really just a matter of time before the next war danger comes, before the next country is targeted. They have and they need a constant list of countries that are the new enemy states to justify that massive military-industrial complex, and to really preserve the financial domination of the United States. over the whole world. So having a clear political line, I say this is important from an organizational standpoint because it means that having a network of organizers who already have a clear understanding of how the system works, that have been through the Iraq War, the Libya invasion, Venezuela and Bolivia, as you mentioned, it means that when something happens, we don't have to have a long debate. We don't have to go through a period of confusion from the mainstream media. We understand exactly that this is the U.S. doing what the U.S. government does time and time again. So we're able to spring into action very quickly. And then I think we have people who are very serious. You know, this is not a large organization with tens of millions of dollars and hundreds of staff. This is a volunteer led apparatus. And it's people, working class people, who are organizing day in and day out. We're not just anti-war organizers. We're also organizing around issues of police brutality, housing, and so forth. So we're accumulating skills and discipline and confidence in each other, which allows an organization like ours to act very quickly, despite being not a well-resourced or a well-staffed organization.
And it seems as though this anti-war message and connecting it to those struggles you mentioned, such as police brutality, resonates with working people on a grassroots level. Can you give viewers a brief history of the anti-war movement in the U.S. since the Second Iraq War? I often hear people complain that it disappeared. Is that a fair assessment?
It's an understandable assessment, although it's incorrect. It never disappeared, but it did go into a state of considerable decline under the Obama administration. In 2003 and in 2002, people may recall there were really mass anti-war protests. That's when the Answer Coalition was formed right after September 11th to stop the war in Afghanistan. It then took a leading role in protests in defense of Palestine and in defense of Iraq to stop those war dangers. And there were millions of people in the streets. There were protests of tens and hundreds of thousands almost every month up until the war began in Iraq in March 2003. And they continued, although I would say a lot of the mainstream opposition to the war, by which I mean sort of the congressional opposition or the people who were kind of dragging their feet about supporting the war, a lot of them basically gave up their anti-war messaging and fell in line behind the Bush administration at that time on the basis that we had to, quote, support our troops, which is really just a slogan meant to discipline people from not having a criticism. It actually has nothing to do with actually supporting troops or veterans. It's a political message. And so I'd say that in 2003, I mean, this could take a long time to go through each year, but I think, but to really to go through it a little bit more quickly, I think there are a lot of people who obviously believe the Democrats are going to not be the war party. And so when John Kerry ran in 2004, there were a lot of anti-war organizers who basically put their anti-war organizing on the side and said we have to do anything to get anybody but Bush. And it was much harder to organize that year. Then 2005 comes. The Iraqi resistance had actually picked up in its activity, so there were more U.S. casualties. 2005, there was again a resurgence of anti-war activity. 2007, when Bush's approval ratings were really low on account of the war, which we should remember was not always the case. Right after September 11th, Bush had 80, 90% approval ratings. That means a lot of the Democrats, the liberal media, were all supporting Bush. So that sort of media environment does have an impact. Anyway, but to move forward, I think people thought that Obama was somehow going to be the anti-war candidate. In fact, he had campaigned and said he was going to bring troops from Iraq to Afghanistan, what he called the good war. And some of the big anti-war sort of elements in society, they kind of, I think they basically packed it up.
Right.
And
they supported his actions in Libya and Syria specifically. It was almost impossible to organize the kind of liberal progressive wing of the anti-war movement around those conflicts because they fell for these narratives that, you know, these are such evil bad guys and evil dictators that the U.S. has a responsibility to protect civilians abroad.
Right. So you saw a different elaboration of sort of the military doctrine or strategy from the Obama administration. It was a lot more sophisticated than you would say the crass, hegemonic kind of rhetoric.
With
that was
us or against us.
Yeah, exactly. So it was more sophisticated and had an impact on the anti-war movement. It also, I'd say that the media played a very big role in both Syria and Libya. They had a very unified message. And the media itself, I think, functions in terms of enforcing discipline, even among the political elites. I think, and so the editorial boards of the Washington Post, the New York Times, all these groups, the conservative, moderates, liberals, they have sort of different labels. But when it came to Syria and Libya, when it comes to foreign policy in general, they all really speak with the same voice. And that's meant to close political space for dissent and opposition. And that has an impact in the progressive movement as well. I think, though, I mean, to end on a more optimistic note, I think people are starting to, in a way, reevaluate the foreign policy of the Obama administration. You see Hillary Clinton, I think, was really not a popular candidate among the Democratic base because she was associated with militarism and an aggressive foreign policy. And by extension, I would say that extends to Joe Biden and Obama. So I think that there is, this is now a generation of young people who have seen the Iraq War, have seen the disastrous interventions. So I think people aren't falling for it as much as before. And I think that was seen this past weekend.
As someone committed to organizing within the anti-war movement, how do you look or view the Democratic race for the nomination for president? How do you, what do you look in terms of when you're watching the debates? What do you look for, and how do you assess individual candidates, or how much importance do you put into the Democratic Party, period?
Well, I mean, I'm not a Democrat. I don't vote Democrat. So, I mean, in that sense, on a personal standpoint, I'm not looking to any of them as the salvation. I think that obviously what's said in the debates is important because, you know, it helps drive the news cycle. It helps drive, and what the campaigns are saying is important because it helps drive people's consciousness. I mean, class consciousness, political consciousness, all types of things are being shaped day by day by the news cycle. So we can't just ignore what they're saying. I think it's been quite it's been quite bad in general what the Democratic debates are when they talk about foreign policy. On many things, they're actually to the right of Trump. They're saying he shouldn't have negotiated with North Korea. They pick their issues on Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, they're further to the right. The Democratic Party is one of human history's one of its great war parties. I mean, when you really think about its history going back for the last century, it is very deeply tied into an aggressive and militaristic foreign policy. And obviously the candidates are contending for the leadership of that party and that apparatus. So I think there's a kind of a million threads that tie them back to an imperialist foreign policy. I think Bernie's statements as of late are better, obviously, than the others. Cory Booker pretty much endorsed the strike right away. Elizabeth Warren had quite an awful hot take, I thought, but I wouldn't even call it a hot take because it actually looked like it was identical to Liz Cheney's tweet. Liz Cheney and Liz Warren had sort of a shared talking points on the day after. The Liz take, exactly. So, I think to the extent that there are Democratic candidates who are saying anti-war things, that helps the anti-war message and movement break into larger audiences. So I don't think we should just dismiss it out of hand. I saw people at the protest carrying Bernie signs, some Tulsi signs, and I'm not going to vote for who they're going to vote for. But on the other hand, we're there in a united front to stop the war with Iran. And I'm sure from the perspective of the people of Iran or the Middle East, they want the broadest and widest possible anti-war movement. So I think we should keep that in mind as we're organizing too.
Well, as you mentioned, Answer had planned these recent demonstrations even before the U.S. carried out these assassinations, but the crowds certainly were much larger perhaps than anticipated because of this feeling that the Trump administration was pushing to war. But now that it seems that all-out war is on hold, how do we keep the momentum going?
It's a good question. I think we shouldn't assume that all-out war is on hold. I mean, the way the wars happen, it's often not via a script. There are sort of people who have plans and strategies, of course, and some, obviously. I mean, you could see this assassination as an act of war, a declaration of war. It seems the only possible thinking behind it would be to provoke a war, to climb the escalation ladder. There have been some voices that are obviously trying to walk that back. Trump himself may be trying to walk that back. But once that escalation ladder is being climbed, we don't really know where it ends. And I think that's the important thing. I mean, he says he doesn't want a war. Then the next day he's saying he's going to wipe out 52 important sites in Iran, including cultural sites with civilian populations. So this is a guy who apparently made this decision to assassinate General Soleimani with 15 minutes of deliberation. So who knows what tomorrow's going to bring? I think it would be really ridiculous for the anti-war movement or any progressive person to think, oh, well, we should just assume this is now under control. He has a massive military budget, thanks to the Democrats and the Republicans together. He has a massive military apparatus, and I think a lot of these Pentagon generals are, they think of themselves, they are detached from reality. They think they can win any kind of war, and who knows what tomorrow may bring. So I think the most important thing right now, though, is education, is really getting out there. And what I mean by that is like a popular education, being out in the streets with posters, with speak outs, with banners, going on subway cars, being in student halls, talking about it. If you're a progressive teacher, let an anti-war organizer come in and address your class. These types of things are necessary because, of course, there is a section of society that's paying close attention and it immediately hit the streets. And I think just with that crowd, we could have a good-sized protest in the coming weeks, but we need it to be much bigger. And I think a lot of people will be very receptive to the anti-war message, but it's time for the people who are following it, who are anti-war. We have to be very public, very bold. We have to be out speaking to everyone we can.
Well, a point I like to make is that even when bombs are not dropping, the U.S. is waging a very sophisticated hybrid war against countries like Iran and Venezuela. This is something you and I have spoken about together. The reality is we're constantly waging an economic war against millions of people around the world, but we don't feel as a U.S. population as though we're at war. How can we change that?
Well, I think the alternative media plays a very big role. We have to humanize the real, what these words mean, sanctions. I mean, it sounds like it's sort of like a fine or something that's on some official, and we don't see the human suffering, the tens of thousands killed in Venezuela as a result of sanctions, for instance, or the 500,000 Iraqi children that died because of sanctions between the wars. That is a war. That's a form of economic war, absolutely, and it's causing violence all the same. So I think we can't hope that the New York Times or Washington Post or CNN is going to do that work for us. I think they are specifically designed to hide that reality, to present, they're sort of weapons of mass distraction in a way that they're designed to have people not even think about the world or know about the world, not even know where Iran is. So I think there's a lot of education, as I said, and alternative media plays a very big role. We have to find the voices from Iran and Iraq also, and how do we get their voices on the TV screens or on the computer screens or on the cell phone screens of people in the United States. I think it's very important that we stop sort of thinking of ourselves as just sort of in a bubble, that we're one part of humanity, and we have a lot more in common with everyday working class Iraqi and Iranian people than we do with the Donald Trumps of the world or all these celebrities that they make us, they want us to be fascinated with their personal lives.
That's a very important point about the unity between the working class here and Iran. We have more in common with them than with our leaders. That's a point that I think can't be made enough. A lot of people might be watching this and say, well, I'm against war, but I'm more concerned about putting food on the table, figuring out how to get health care or pay for my children's education. What do you say to those people?
Well, it's understandable. People have to eat. People got to live. People have to have housing. And none of those things are guaranteed. I mean, that's the capitalist system we live under. None of those things you don't have the right to the basics to live. So we understand why people are anxious about them. But when you start to think about how to resolve those problems, then you have to look at the military budget first and foremost. And this is where I think, Bernie's been speaking some about this, but historically, has not as much. But you can't do any of these sort of bold, progressive, social democratic policies to build a safety net for the 140 million Americans who are in or near poverty if you don't do something about the military budget, the greatest drain and waste, which is only producing bombs and bullets and bases and things that you can't consume to live. You can't consume those bullets and planes, but those are your tax dollars that are going to it. And if you want to do anything sort of progressive and sweeping to really support poor and working class people in this country, we're going to need to redirect those resources to infrastructure and to programs to help people here. Even when you look at China, which is one of the countries that's been extremely demonized in the media and both the Democrats and the Republicans, I think everyone kind of recognizes China has this high growth rate. China has a high, sort of the consumer spending of the average Chinese worker and middle class is growing quite a bit while wages here are stagnant. You know, part is because China hasn't been engaged in any massive wars. And they've been able to redirect more and more of their infrastructure, their technology, and their wealth towards those things. So I think that, you know, that is a message we have to carry into the anti-war movement as well, that these aren't, you know, foreign policy and domestic policy are deeply interconnected. We have to foreground, of course, who's going to be immediately impacted by a war on Iran, which is the Iranian people, but we have to be able to speak to how this issue affects all of us, whether or not you're following foreign policy. Foreign policy is having an impact on your life.
We'll tell viewers why we all need to join the anti-war movement and how they can get involved if they're watching at home.
Well, the Answer Coalition has, you know, all the social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and our website. Another call to action will be coming out shortly, maybe by the time this is out. And I think that our mission is to make the 80 or 90 cities from this past weekend even greater. And each of those protests should be larger than the first one. That's got to be our goal. It's not all going to happen at night, but by each one reaching, I don't want to say one, that's even too slow. We have to each one reach 3 or 4 people. I mean, that's really how movements are built. That's how every movement's been built. No one else is going to magically come in and build our movement for us. You know, we have to do it.
And the time really is now, because people here are suffering. Perhaps sometimes it feels like more than ever before, because we just forget about the working people here, and we're on the brink of perhaps a devastating war in the Middle East once again. So I encourage viewers to check out the Answer Coalition. I always say, when I see massive demonstrations all over, especially out of this weekend, I saw answer signs everywhere. So that's a testament to the organizing you all are doing. Thank you so much, Ben Becker, for that work and also for speaking with me today.
Thanks so much for having us, Anya.